presenter and reporter, specialising in football, and I freelance for so many different stations, radio, television, but mainly you probably recognise me from ESPN, particularly if you live in America. Obviously you don't, you're in France.
Well, ESPN is really famous in Africa, not in France. But I have a question concerning more your job.
Yep.
You've said at the beginning that now you don't have the time sometimes to say everything you want. You have to be short and precise, and you have that time restraint. How do you deal with that time restraint in your job, or that pressure of making short content and good quality content at the same time?
It's a really good question, because over the years I've been used to doing as much as I want, having lots of time to do documentary styles, just to bring out the story. And now everything has to be done in 90 seconds so people don't get bored. So one of the biggest things I do is I try not to do too much of an introduction. Oh, hello, here we are, we're outside Wembley, the home of English football. The arch stands above us. I used to do all that stuff. Now it's straight into it. We're here because there's a game, straight into the match. So you just have to sort of think about little things like that. But it is difficult, and I think it's also a shame because I love the developing story. But unfortunately, that's the way that the industry's going. You just have to be aware of it, I think.
And another question, do you see, when you make a report, do you see more yourself as a content producer or as a journalist?
It's a good question, and I think it depends on the story. I think if you're sort of delving into something a bit more deeply, then obviously you are a journalist. And obviously, yeah, and similarly, you're more on content if it's just watching something that's unfolding in front of you. So, I mean, primarily I'm always a journalist. I'm looking for the deeper story. But I think for me, I just want to bring entertainment to people, enjoyment, and bring a story. I like to do things in a different angle, maybe talk about things in a way that other people might not see it. So I try and always look for the other angle, perhaps.
As you said, you like to look at the other angle. Generally now we look at some news like go.com, or news that really specialize into sport. And most of the time, sometimes they take the same story, they just rearrange it. Or how do you do to get that unique information to share with the people? How do you do to get that unique information, or how to change it into a unique information?
I think it's about having your own style, and I think when you know your style or your niche, it's a lot easier to find that. So when I do interviews with players, I always like to think about what makes them the kind of player they are, and I'll ask questions perhaps about their childhood. Maybe most other stations, they care about the next game, the goal they last scored, but you've heard that a million times. So for me, I like to know, like when I interviewed Robin van Persie, I wanted to know about what he was like as a kid. You know, did he always play with footballs? Did he sleep with a football when he went in his cot? And he started to smile, and he opened up to me, and he started telling me stories about his childhood that maybe other people wouldn't have got, because I asked the question. Whereas I think if you ask questions that footballers are used to, you get the same answers, and you see it out there. So you've got to just try and think of a slightly different way. Another trick that I do is I try and ask around and find someone who knows them, but maybe they don't know that I would have spoken to them, and get a story about them. And then you throw the story out there, and they're like, wow. And suddenly they feel comfortable with you because they know that you've spoken to a person who's told you that story.
Yeah, for sure.
So nowadays it's really easy because you have Twitter, so you can message people. You can say, listen, I've got an interview with whoever it is, Fernando Torres, and I'd really like to have your take on him when he was at Atletico. Tell me a bit more, like the first time round. And yeah, I think you can just get a little bit more that way. So you've just got to think outside the box, I guess.
Yeah. You've interviewed a lot of players, a lot of people from the football sector. The INSEEC students and the students in France and the young people in France are fan of football. That's the best sport since the past 50 years. Do you have one story to share with us and with the INSEEC students about someone that you interviewed and a funny story about your career?
Wow, that's a good question. There's so many. I mean, first of all, because we're speaking about France, I have to say that I've just come back from the Euros, obviously, I was based in Paris.
Unfortunately, we've lost.
I
we've
felt
win,
so
we've
sad
win.
for you because you did so well. and I followed France really closely. Actually, I saw so many of the French games. You know what? It was Portugal's story. It had to happen. The whole Cristiano Ronaldo thing.
True,
but I know it's
true.
painful. But it was just such a phenomenal experience. I noticed actually that the supporters based in Paris didn't seem quite as passionate as perhaps the supporters in Marseille or Bordeaux. There were certain regions where I could see such huge support, and it was like a religion to them, kind of thing. Who have I interviewed? I'm trying to pick a French player for you. Patrice Evra, he's really funny.
Really?
Years ago, just before Chelsea against Manchester United in the Champions League, the Russia final, I interviewed Evra, and basically I think footballers just get so bored. They have this mix zone they have to walk through. They always put their headphones on, and you've got to try and find a way to like get them to talk to you basically, and stop them. And I remember Evra just walking through, and he was like, "Oh, we've done enough interviews. Please no, please no." And you have to sort of be quite cheeky, and you're like, "Patrice, I'll ask you one question, please, just one question." So he comes over, and then of course you don't. You ask loads of questions, and he was like, "Okay, I'll only talk to you, and only if it's one question." But then I got all the other journalists over, and I said, "Look, let's just do all this together, because I think that's the way you have to do it. Basically, you have to work as a team with the rest of the journalists." Players, I mean, gosh, there's so many stories. I have to have a little think. Someone like Petr Cech I like interviewing because he's so smart, and he will really think about the mistakes that he's made, and even if he's made a massive error to cost the club the game, he'll hold his hands up, "It was my fault, and I'll talk to you." I have a bit of an embarrassing story once that I had an interview with David Beckham when he was playing for Real Madrid, and I was watching him in the training session beforehand, and his PR person came up to me and said, "I'm afraid Beckham's had to cancel the interview." And I thought, "Oh, I don't know why." So I thought, okay, well, fine. So I went home, and then about an hour later I had a phone call. "Alison, where are you? David Beckham's waiting for you." And I was like, well, I was told that the interview was cancelled, so you can imagine I dashed out of my house.
Sure.
I'm in my taxi, I get there, and he was so kind, and I was all panicked. "I'm so sorry, I'm an hour late for you." I said, "Don't worry about it. Sit down, put your feet up. What can I get you? A glass of water? How about some champagne? Come to my fridge." So, you know, sometimes the footballers are in a hurry and they're not that pleasant to be around, but other times they can just be so just normal and so nice.
Yeah.
So
And
puts you at ease.
I've never personally interviewed a professional player. That's a chance that you have. But do you think when you have that moment with the player, and he's not surrounded by all the communication team and all the PR and all this is the moment where you can have the best authentic moments?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest problem is press officers, obviously they have a job, they have to be there, it's important for them to be there, but they will stop certain conversations flowing, they don't like you to get into too much detail about certain things, but often the best moments I have with a player are the moments before the cameras are rolling. I always try and have a little chat just to loosen them up, and just always try and say a funny story or something just to make them feel comfortable, and often a PR person will say, "Right, your time's starting." And I think sometimes they forget, but those moments are almost more important than the interview itself. You have to get that sort of rapport with the player, because it's hard to just sit down with someone and suddenly be spark into life, even though they're media trained. But you're absolutely right. When you're with just a player on their own, and it has happened to me a few times. I did an interview with Christian Fuchs after Leicester left back after Leicester won the Premier League so miraculously. And there was no press officer there, and he was so authentic, he was so real, and we had a great interview. And yeah, when a press officer's around, it's a very, very different story for sure.
I have a real question about the pressure in your job. Most of the time we see players being angry against journalists, saying, "Oh, it's always about journalists, you guys say whatever you want to say, if I say something you're going to deform what I'm saying." How do you do to face those kind of the players that are often angry against the journalists?
Yeah. Well, the biggest thing for me is because I do primarily television, we can't twist words. Like when it's written, you can twist words, headlines can be twisted, but for me, whatever the player says, it goes straight out on camera exactly the same way. And the other thing that I think is important is I've worked for 2 clubs. I've worked for Real Madrid and I've worked for Chelsea, and I often say to the players, we're here to support you, we're here to give you good press because we work for the club channel at the end of the day. So, you know, even if a player says something stupid, and they have done in the past, I've edited stuff that John Terry said, I've taken it out before because I thought, oh, that's not going to go down well with the fans. And David Beckham has said something a bit silly before, and I've taken that out as well. You know, nothing bad, but just we help them, and then I think then you can then go to the player afterwards and say, oh, by the way, I took that bit out where you said this because I don't think it will go down well. And then suddenly they realise, oh, okay, she's on our side. Exactly, and it's not like you're trying to trick them, but you want to get, of course you want exclusive interviews, you want exclusive content, but you want to do it in a way that the player's happy to have given it to you, not the fact that you've tricked them into doing it, because then, you know, your relationship with them lasts that long rather than a whole career. That's the one thing I would say as well. As a journalist, it's so important to have a good reputation, and for people to know that you're not going to screw them over, you're not going to say something wrong, you know, twist their words, because that's how you continue to get interviews as your career progresses.
Yeah. Also, I just wanted to speak about one topic, particularly about the female journalists in the journalist sector, in sports journalist sector. In France, in some the best shows, we've been seeing the new female journalists for the past maybe 5 years. But you were one of the first in the sector. So, what is the advice, and what would you want for new journalists, and do you have an advice for them to be, how do you say, to be hopeful in their career?
Definitely. I mean, it's a real shame there aren't more girls in the industry. There should be. If you're passionate about football, and there's lots of girls out there who absolutely love their football, you shouldn't be put off. You do have to work very hard against some of the sexism which does exist. Personally, I think it's best to just ignore it. I've never felt like a girl in football. I've just felt like someone who works in football, who loves football. Yeah. I've never really, I think I changed myself in the beginning. I made myself a bit more masculine. I dressed differently. I made sure that I didn't stand out too much from the crowd. I didn't want the male journalist to think, oh, you know, what's she doing here? And then obviously after I've done it for years and years and years, I started to feel a bit more confident that I can put some lipstick on in the press box. You know, just when I'm waiting to interview a player, because I've got to be on camera, you know, I have to look good. But in the past, I think I was too afraid to look good because I didn't want men talking negatively about me. It's a real shame, but I think it's getting better. There's a lot of groups out there that are supporting women. I know in England there's a group called Women in Football, which is incredibly supportive. It highlights any sexism that goes on as well. And I think just be strong if you love it. Be adamant. I'm here for a reason, and don't let people say, oh, but you're a girl. It doesn't matter. You're passionate about what you do and you're good at it. So
Passion is actually.
Yeah.
One last thing.
Yep.
For you and for the students, what would you give as the best definition of sport and passion about sport? What is your best definition of sport?
Ooh, that's a tough question. You saved the rest till last. Sport, I mean, I think it came up in the conference as well, but sport is like a religion to some people. It's not just a game. The result matters. It can change your entire persona, your entire week.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it's tribal, and I think it is like a religion. I think obviously it's about a result at the end of the day, but there's so much more that goes into it, isn't there? And there's the history of your club makes such a difference. So even if things have gone on before you were even born, so it's hard to put that in one sentence. But I think sports is a passion, a religion.
All right. Thank you very much for giving us that really precious time.
Good luck to everyone as well. Good luck. Work
right
hard.
And I'm sure you influenced a lot of students that are going to watch you, and maybe one journalist is going to become a journalist and have a great career because of you.
Oh, thank you. I hope so. I'd
We'll
love to encourage people to do what I do because I love my job, and I think one of the things I read a quote is that if you love what you do, you don't have to work a day in your life, and it's true. I don't feel like I work. I just feel like I do my hobby and someone pays me for it. So. Thank you.
Thank you very
Cheers.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.